Great, lovely. Warm welcome, everyone, to this evening's seminar. This evening, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Valerie Long. Valerie received her PhD in classics from the University of Buffalo in 2025, and her doctoral research focused on Mediterranean archaeology, and she's going to give you some more details in her talk. She works full-time doing educational programming for the York County History Centre, and she's an adjunct professor in the Department of History at Messiah University. Valerie has been excavating on the island of Stromboli, one of the Aeolian Islands, since 2014, and she currently serves as the team's glass specialist. And she lives in Pennsylvania with her partner and her border collie, Kona. Okay, so let me hand over then to Valerie. You're going to speak to us about the Aeolian Islands in the Roman period.
Yes, I'm very excited. Thank you everyone for being here. Give me a second here to share my screen. Um, but yeah, I'm very delighted to be able to talk to everyone about a project that I've been working on for quite a while and for um, a place that has been near and dear to my heart for over a decade. That is the Aeolian Islands. Can everyone see my screen and everything before I get kind of started here? Because I've got out the pictures of everyone sort of tiny, so I want to make sure that, okay. All right. The Aeolian Islands, most people that I meet on the day-to-day basis don't know a lot about them. I suspect some of you here may know at least of the name of them, especially as we are rereading our Homer in time for this summer's adaptation of the Odyssey. But the Aeolian Islands are a small archipelago located in the southern Tyrrhenian Sea, just north of Sicily. They're comprised of seven islands. That's Lipari, Vulcano, Stromboli, Salina, Panarea, Filicudi, and Alicudi. They are named, of course, for their connection to Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, seen first in Book 10 of the Odyssey. This connection is even confirmed through the archaeological record. There was a votive offering dating to about 550 BCE dedicated to Aeolus in the form of his name inscribed on a jug that was discovered in a special pit referred to as the Bothros of Aeolus, located on the Acropolis of Lipari. This name, being connected to Aeolus, is a very apt one. The islands are windy to the point of being disruptive, especially if you're trying to navigate along the sea. It can be kind of dangerous today, and so presumably dangerous throughout antiquity. Pliny the Elder and others also point out that there is another name for the islands in an association with an alternate god, that of Hephaestus or Vulcan. This is yet another appropriate name, as the islands were home to active volcanoes throughout their history, two of which are active to varying degrees, that is Stromboli and Vulcano. Stromboli is active daily. Around the beginning of the Neolithic period, a long break in volcanic activity on Lipari allowed for stability and the ability for human settlement. There is evidence to suggest that the past volcanic eruptions were disruptive, violent, cataclysmic, and that is just sort of living there as an inherent risk to living in the shadow of a volcano. By the Roman period, while there was some seismic and volcanic activity, there were no catastrophic events until the 4th century CE, when a destructive earthquake hit much of the Mediterranean, including Lipari and likely the other islands. Living on these islands was and is not without its challenges. Despite this, though, they are all inhabited today and are even popular tourist attractions during the summer months. One of the biggest challenges is that the islands do not, nor did they ever, possess an abundant natural supply of fresh water, if any at all. Thucydides talks about it in the 5th century BCE that the Athenians in Sicily and the Rhegians are unable to make an advance to the islands because there aren't any water on them. The lack of water is serious even today in the 21st century. All of the water is imported via a water tanker from the mainland, and so houses have to very closely monitor their water supply. Otherwise, they can be without water for as long as it takes to pump water into their cisterns or for the water tanker to arrive. Just, oops. There we go. Despite being the home to active volcanoes and the lack of fresh water, these islands have had many instances of human occupation and interaction. And there's no doubt in my mind or other scholars' minds that the archipelago has played a critical role in the early history of the central Mediterranean. They're located on an extremely strategic position near the Straits of Messina. My research, however, focuses on only one period, that of the Roman period. Much of the current scholarship that's out there today is focused on the volcanoes themselves or the early periods of the Neolithic Bronze Age or the Greek colonies. I've put some pictures up here to show you that obsidian was very high quality from Lipari, and in the Neolithic period, it had a very wide distribution range, wider than many of the other of the obsidian sources with their own sort of cultural group there, known as Capo Graziano, which was located on a couple of the islands. And that cultural group had a connection with the Eastern Mediterranean. They found Mycenaean pottery and such all throughout the islands. There's also been a lot of study on the Greek colonies that end up there. Um, some of you might have be familiar with this a little bit. They have there's been a lot of studies done on some of the terracotta masks and terracotta figurines because they're all sort of focused on tragedy and comedy plays. And in the end of the 5th and 4th century BCE, when the red figure ware market kind of shifts to Sicily and southern Italy, Lipari has its own sort of part to play in that. I put an image of one of the vessels that's found on Lipari done by a painter that is presumably from the area. And you can see that there's some blue painted on there, and there's addition of red and white and green. They're really quite remarkable. So there's been a lot of scholarship on these periods, but there's really been nothing on the Roman period. So my work provides an up-to-date synthesis of the archaeological materials combined with the ancient sources to kind of just have a timeline and to talk a little bit about what those materials can be used to say about what life was like on the islands, how the Romans utilized them, how the islands sort of functioned as a broader part of the Roman network. But today, since I only have about 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to focus primarily on Lipari. It's the largest island. It has seen the most activity throughout its entire history. So I'm just going to give sort of a brief timeline of that activity in the Roman period and offer some conclusions about life on the islands and the various ways the Romans sort of exploited and used them. And I'll bring in some of the other evidence from the other islands when I talk about that. The earliest interaction the Romans have with the Aeolian Islands was not really a pleasant one. In 396 BCE, in honor of their victory at Veii, they actually sent some ambassadors with a golden bowl to offer to Apollo at Delphi. Livy tells us that on their way there, the ship is captured and everyone on board is captured as well. The Romans, though, continued to sail around the area in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. They trade wine from Campania, evidenced by the various shipwrecks discovered near many of the islands. The Romans had a treaty with Carthage that allowed them to access that trade in certain parts of the Mediterranean. By the mid 3rd century BCE, however, Rome had entered into its first war with Carthage. And if you know your Punic War history, you know that it was largely a naval battle around Sicily. The Romans again come in contact with Lipari, and they are actually defeated sometime around 260, 259 BCE. But only 8 years after that humiliation, the Romans were able to besiege the island. Evidence of this is found in the historic record in texts from Xenarius, Frontinus, and Valerius Maximus, but also actually in the archaeological record on Lipari. Archaeologists uncovered spearheads, arrowheads made of iron, round stone, catapult projectiles dating to around the first half of the 3rd century BCE. And after this point, the Romans will control the Aeolian Islands, and they'll use them as a base of operation in the Second Punic War and beyond. Following the wars with Carthage, presumably the seas around the Aeolian Islands in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE would be relatively safe from a great enemy like Carthage. However, the ancient texts tell us that it's a rather volatile period in terms of volcanic activity. Strabo and other sources record violent eruptions, likely actually at the island of Vulcano, but it's very close to Lipari, so it sometimes gets kind of confused in the sources. And that happens in the 2nd century BCE. Pliny the Elder records that during the Social War in the 1st century BCE that there's another sort of volcanic episode between the islands of Lipari and Volcano, and that the area burned for several days. But despite the notable volcanic activity around the island, the archaeological record demonstrates that this was a period of rebuilding and improvement on Lipari. One of the earliest locations for this was the Acropolis, which was the most secure spot in the city. There had been previous buildings there, but they had all been leveled and new ones built on top of it. The area along the coast and the modern day harbor also experienced a period of new construction, which included a port and some Roman homes. In the mid 1st century BCE, Lipari was used as evidence in a court case. If you know your Cicero, then you know Cicero, his trial against Verres, the former governor of Sicily. Cicero accuses him of corruption and financially abusing the people on Lipari. The description of the situation on Lipari, according to Cicero, sounds bleak, as Lipari was described as poverty-stricken. Diodorus Siculus, writing close to the time of Cicero, offered a different view of Lipari's state around the same time, calling the island fruitful and able to support a high degree of luxury. Unlike Cicero, Diodorus claimed that Lipari was in fact quite prosperous and comfortable, productive, and not barren. Diodorus explained what made the island so prosperous was a resource found in abundance, which most now translate as alum. Proving this archaeologically, though, is a challenge. In 1993, in an area south of the current and ancient city of Lipari, a ceramic workshop was discovered dating during this time in the 1st century BC up to the 3rd century CE. Ceramic wasters were discovered in the ancient kiln, confirming that a particular type of amphorae, Richborough 527, were made on Lipari. The vessels themselves are rather poor quality due to the porous nature of the clay and could not hold any liquid in them. So one of the likeliest substances that were in these vessels was probably the alum. And I'll mention that a little bit later in this presentation, but it was an important and valuable substance for the Romans. At the end of the 1st century BCE, Lipari again finds itself not only in trouble with the Romans, but as the location of a strategic naval base. Around 40 BCE, the people of Lipari sided with Sextus Pompey in his civil war against Octavian, and they were punished as a result, being deported to Naples for the duration of the war. Octavian then left his right-hand man, Agrippa, amongst the islands. He used Lipari, Stromboli, and Vulcano as temporary bases. Agrippa would then go on to defeat the forces of Pompey. The early imperial period point to a prosperous time on Lipari. The city continued to expand and improve. Sometime in the late first and early 2nd century CE, the Romans added to the thermal bath of San Calogero, originally built during the Mycenaean period. They added a large rectangular pool with an ambulatory around it and then covered it with a barrel vault. In the same time period, 2 large homes were discovered from the same time period in the modern day city that had been built kind of within the original 4th century BCE Greek walls of the city. And nearby, but outside of the city walls, was a bathhouse. The baths were first discovered by Captain W.H. Smythe in 1830, who preserved his discovery in a letter to his friends. He recorded that there were several rooms, mosaics, and the walls that had clay tubes connected to the hypocaust. This is one of the most curious buildings, I think, on the site, due to the water situation on the Aeolian Islands. The late Roman period is marked by disaster and decline, not necessarily tied to what is happening in Rome in general, but the islands, they have their own sort of ecological problems. As I mentioned kind of at the beginning, in the fourth century CE, there was a major earthquake that hit and sort of damaged the city of Lipari, likely the same one that struck the eastern part of the Mediterranean, recorded in the works of Ammianus Marcellinus. The earthquake might have been among the worst to have ever hit the central Mediterranean, and it is recorded extensively in the archaeological record on Lipari. Following the catastrophic earthquake, it does seem like the people of Lipari rebounded. However, it is questionable by how much. How people lived on the island certainly changed. The port area that I had showed earlier showed evidence of issues with rising sea levels around the third and fourth centuries, and by the fifth century, it was no longer in use. And while there was a sort of limited use of the old city, there seems to be a shift in settlement pattern in the 5th and 6th century CE. The dwellings sort of moved more inland in the inner highlands for their natural protection. And then in the 8th century, the volcano on Lipari had a very significant cataclysmic activity. There were pumice deposits that in some places were 200 meters thick on parts of the island. And now that I've kind of given a sort of brief, very brief timeline of activity on Lipari and more or less some of the other islands, they all kind of follow the same trajectory. I want to shift gears a little here and talk about what life was like on the islands. And we can do this by kind of mining the archaeological evidence and the texts. Once the islands do enter the Roman fold, they were Romanized, at least to some degree. There were certainly Romans who were living on them. By 210 BCE, the Aeolian Islands, particularly Lipari, were among the 68 municipalities of Sicily. They were not treated as a conquered city, but nor contracted out by the censors, but instead were civitates decumanae, communities in the Roman province of Sicily that paid a tithe or a decuma of their agricultural production to Rome. As Cicero related, due to that status during the mid first century BCE, the people on Lipari were compelled to pay a tribute to Rome, or rather to Verres. On Lipari, it is likely that duumvirs were the earliest magistrates, which we see in an inscription in the top left from a coin that included the names of two of the duumvirs, Marcus and Gaius Ansonius. Pliny the Elder recorded that within the first century CE, Lipari was a place that had the rights of a Roman citizen. So it was cum quum Romanorum oppido. One scholar posited that the inhabitants of the island were divided into curiae, and that the election of any local magistrates would be at the hand of the decuriones. The city's main authorities would be the duumvirs and two aediles. This inscription, which is now unfortunately lost, listed the names of at least two of the city's aediles, Nonius and Clodius Thorianus. Epigraphic evidence also confirmed that by the first century CE, there was a procurator assigned to Lipari as an administrator. The inscription must date sometime between the 14 CE when Tiberius became emperor, and 29 CE when Livia died. Procurators were officially appointed by the emperor starting in the period of Augustus. As procurator, Cornelius's job would have included the supervision of Lipari's finances on behalf of Rome. And Roman governments on the islands extended to construction projects as well. And additional fragmentary inscriptions point to more construction projects on the islands during the first century CE, particularly under the rule of the emperors Augustus and Tiberius. There were at least 9 fragments that have been discovered that seem to indicate some sort of dedication by or to the two emperors. Most were found on Lipari, but there's one notable pair found on Selina, which is sort of seen here. It is believed that it was used as dedicatory inscriptions for public works under Tiberius. With the Romans come certain traditions like religion. One would expect to find cult activities, especially for the gods Aeolus and Vulcan. However, there does not seem to be anything, any remains of temples, or even any definite evidence of cult activity found on the islands for the Roman period. But there at least seems to be evidence of rituals occurring on Lipari. There was a clay figurine sort of seen here in the center that was dated to the late Republic or early Imperial periods. It consists, if you look kind of closely, it's not the greatest picture, but it consists of two barefoot men wearing short knee-length tunics. The man on the right has his head draped and his arm around the man on the left, who is shorter and presumably younger. The shorter man, if you can look closely, you can see that he's blowing into a pair of tibiae. The veil and bare feet suggest a religious scene, very likely a priest and his assistant performing a funeral scene. Tibiae were often used for funerary rites, but were also used at feasts, triumphs, and even to heal gout. Archaeological evidence further confirms that funerary rituals, or at least some sort of ritual, such as that seen in the ceramic figurine, occurred on Lipari. In 2013, an inhumation burial was discovered dating to the 1st century CE that contained a pair of these bronze tibiae seen here. During the late Republic and early Imperial periods, the wealth on the islands increased significantly, manifesting in the form of luxury goods and elaborate buildings. The clearest signs of wealth on the islands can be seen through structures. We'll look at some of these in a few moments here. But small finds on the islands, particularly those found in graves, point to many people with a certain degree of wealth living on Libri. The best evidence comes from the two necropolises on Libri, particularly in the form of gold jewelry. Of the 565 burials in the Diana Contrada necropolis, 72 contained gold jewelry or ornaments. Some of that jewelry contained precious stones. There was also imported goods from far distances, including fine ceramics, glass objects that probably contained some sort of perfumes. Small finds are also valuable in helping to uncover what workshops may have been in operation on the island. Some of these workshops may have been creating goods for trade, while other smaller workshops were likely in operation for the people actually living on the islands themselves. As we know, there was at least one kiln in operation on Lipari producing the Richborough 527 amphorae, but there was also evidence that other vessels, including Dressel 2 and 4 amphorae, common thin-walled wares, bricks, loom weights were all produced there as well, but using imported clay from Sicily. One of the main questions that I would love to be able to answer a little bit more definitively would be who lived on the islands. To answer this, more work and analysis would need to be done. For now, though, there is some archaeological evidence that and subsequent analysis that point to a potentially diverse population. In a recent 2023 study, radiocarbon dating and genetic testing was done on 2 of 4 skeletons that had been found during a rescue excavation. They dated 2 of the male bodies that had shared mitochondrial DNA to the Republican period. They also determined that they were of African descent. The results, while interesting and significant, could have maybe been a little bit more surprising. African people could have lived on the islands in the 3rd century BCE when they were an ally of the Carthaginians. They could have migrated there from nearby Sicily as the island had genetic links to Africa from earlier periods. But further study of any human remains could help to uncover how much of the ancient population had African descent. I would be extremely curious if we were able to do some more genetic testing on some of the bodies found. Um, by the late imperial period, there appeared to be more traceable diversity living on Lipari that can be found through some of the finds, particularly in the burials. In the mid 1970s, excavators discovered a funerary hypogeum, revealing about five tightly packed tombs. The final tomb added to the hypogeum, also known as Tomb E, was actually inscribed with a menorah, which has been, of course, identified as Jewish iconography. And thus, it's sort of assumed that the entire hypogeum was a Jewish burial. Jewish people were not the only religious group on the islands in the late Roman period. There is evidence that by at least the 4th century CE, Christianity had spread to Lipari, and perhaps even the other islands as well. Inscriptions can provide the best evidence for this. On Lipari, the oldest Christian funerary inscription dates to 394 CE, determined by the consuls Neomachus and Honorius. This inscription was not an isolated instance. In fact, there were at least three other inscriptions that could be considered Christian. Two seem to follow a formula that's like kind of like I fell asleep in peace and faith, as seen here. At this point, the evidence presented offers a glimpse at what life may have been like on the archipelago. There is definite evidence that Roman culture has permeated all of the islands, and that at least for Lipari, it was very much part of the Roman sphere. With the arrival of the Romans, there was an influx of wealth and growth. Continued research may be able to better address kind of who else was living on the islands. In the first kind of like two-thirds of this presentation, I've mentioned sort of the various challenges of living on the archipelago, from the lack of fresh water to the volcanoes with regular, sometimes very violent activity, to the difficult seascapes surrounding the coasts. So one of the sort of reasons I wanted to study this is why then did the Romans want to settle in these places? They have the entire Mediterranean in their sort of grasp. Well, really, the sort of usefulness, the utilization of the Aeolian Islands is why they're extremely valuable, and that's kind of what I'm going to spend the last few moments here talking about how these islands were used. For the sake of keeping it kind of orderly for myself and for you, I've kind of divided up the use into three categories. That is economic usefulness, political usefulness, and sort of leisure activities, leisurely usefulness. Um, Economic, of course, is a big one. The natural resources from the Aeolian Islands have been extracted for thousands of years. The volcano not only provided fertile soil, but also important byproducts from the volcano, volcanic stones and other minerals. The various volcanic stones, especially on Lipari, were formed during the different geological phases. They were quarried not only for use on the islands themselves, but were actually exported to nearby places like Sicily and even further into the Mediterranean. The different types of stones were used for certain architectural features, sarcophagi, funerary stelae. Lava stones were excellent for grinding grain and were often chosen for that purpose. There has been archaeometric studies from samples of stones taken from Messina, which is pretty close by, that have revealed that it was highly likely that volcanic stones were quarried from Volcano to create millstones. And it's very possible also that Filicudi had millstones taken from there because they have evidence of millstones being taken from that particular island through the early 20th century. So, it's not impossible to think that. Pumice extraction on Lipari occurred well into the 20th century. This tradition is very well recorded on the island. There was at one point a museum that kind of explored the pumice extraction process. It also occurred during the Roman period as well. That's attested in both written records. Pliny the Elder listed the Aeolian Islands along with Milos and Nisros as one of the top three places to obtain some. There is archaeological evidence that confirms that pumice was not only extracted but was also exported to other parts of the Mediterranean. There were two shipwrecks found near southern France that had and contained cargo that was pumice, and it seems likely that the pumice was used for polishing marble based off of the other finds that were in those shipwrecks. The Aeolian Islands were home to some essential and useful minerals, alum and sulfur. Diodorus Siculus claimed that alum was found nowhere else but on Lipari, and for that reason, it made the Romans extremely wealthy. Strabo also confirmed this. Alum must have been extracted on Lipari by the first century BCE, as both authors were from that period. It is Pliny the Elder in the first century CE, however, that had the most to say about the substance. He recorded that it was extracted from many places in the Mediterranean, including Lipari and Stromboli. Even in the 5th century CE, Lipari was still considered a place to obtain alum. If anyone's familiar with um, Cassius Felix, he made in his work De Medicana made two references to Lipari and alum as part of a medical remedy. Sulfur was another substance found on the Aeolian Islands. Again, Pliny the Elder offered the most thorough account of where sulfur was located and what it was used for. He does not list, however, an exact island where sulfur was extracted. It seems likely that this is coming from Volcano, as it was mined in the 19th century there as well. Another critical resource obtained from the Aeolian Islands was salt. Salt processing could be found on a small scale on the island of Salina. The very name of the island, which translates to salt pan, suggests that salt processing was part of the fabric of the island. At the southeastern tip of Salina, in an area known as Lingua, there was a natural lake where evidence has been found of Roman salt processing, which unfortunately is now submerged underwater. But if you see on the right side, there's an 18th century dwelling there that shows a opus reticulatum wall dating sometime to the 1st or 2nd century CE. And those are what would have remained of the low dividing walls. Salt was crucial to the production of fish salting and garum, a condiment perhaps of equal importance in the Roman world. And based on the evidence of fish processing found elsewhere in Salina, perhaps this was part of a much larger operation on the island. One of the most obvious uses for the islands was for their strategic location on the Straits of Messina. The peaks on the islands allow for some of the best views of the passages through the Straits of Messina. Visual analysis seen here demonstrates the various critical sightlines. Today, from the piazza at Stromboli, on a clear day, you can see Calabria, you can see the Straits of Messina. So, extremely important and strategic. The Romans certainly utilized these, at least in the first few hundred years of their interactions with the islands, particularly in the First and Second Punic Wars, and finally in the Civil War against Sextus Pompey. And I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, you don't know what you got until it's gone. But in the 6th century CE, the Roman historian Procopius recorded what happens when the Romans had lost control of the Aeolian Islands. It had massive effects on the city, like contributing to famine there. And they did feel those consequences. One of the most interesting sort of political uses of the Aeolian Islands and other small islands began in the imperial period. Became places of exile. The written sources listed Lipari as a spot of exile in the 3rd century CE under the reign of Septimius Severus. At this point, there had been several hundred years of political exile occurring on islands. During the reign of Septimius Severus, Plautilla, the wife of the delightful Caracalla, and her brother were exiled to Lipari. Two accounts by Dio Cassius and Herodian mention this event, but they vary in the treatment of Plautilla when she arrived on the island. One says it was not bad, and one said it was bad. Exile to islands occurred into the 20th century. So during World War II, several political prisoners called Lipari home such as Etta Mussolini, the daughter of Benito Mussolini. In much the same way as today, Mediterranean islands will also attract an elite crowd, either out of desire to sort of just recuperate, enjoy the beautiful atmosphere, or to visit some of the amenities on the islands. Um, there is a small islet called Basiluzzo, which is close to where Panarea is. It's not an island today, but just sort of like a small islet. It is uninhabited and uninhabitable. Yet during the early imperial period, there was the location of a luxurious villa found there. A few wall fragments help date the structure to the early imperial period, very likely Augustan or Tiberian, while still, this is all very relatively preliminary since no excavation has taken place on the island. The working hypothesis, though, is that it was not a villa proper, as we all kind of think of them, but it was more of a scattering of pavilions. The reason for this seems to be the sort of irregular terrain. The most luxurious pavilion was discovered on an elevated point with a spectacular view of the sea. It contained painted plaster in various colors, some of which was frescoed. It's possible that that particular pavilion was the triclinium, and the Romans are not immune to a stunning landscape, especially at a villa site. The poet Statius, who wrote about his friend's villa at Tibur, says, "What joys my mind recalls! What a host of wonders to the weary, the dazzled eyes! How soft the landscape! What beauty of that fair sight before art touched it! Nowhere has nature indulged herself so freely." And the Aeolian Islands are nothing if not spectacularly beautiful. Besides this beautiful landscape in and of itself, Lipari was home to a natural thermal bath at San Caligaro, I mentioned earlier. Diodorus Siculus recorded that this bath was one of Lipari's claim to fame and a reason for its prosperity. Diodorus was correct. The baths were famed far and wide, and knowledge of them has made it back to Rome itself. The late first and early second century CE poet Martial even made sort of an offhand comment about this thermal bath in one of his epigrams. He says, "Nor does he scorn the baths of Fortunatus, nor those of Faustus, nor yet the gloom of Gryllus and Lupus's Aeolian cavern," which is clearly a reference to, or very likely a reference to this sort of bathhouse. For the three hot baths, he used them again and again. So hopefully this brief survey of island usage on the Aeolian Islands demonstrates that they were actually quite important to the Romans. There were many ways that the islands could be and were utilized. Throughout this presentation, I hope that it has become clear that despite the challenges of living on volcanic islands, the Romans lived among them and used them for many centuries. Their significance is reflected not only here and in other current scholarship, but also articulated as early as the 19th century. In his 1830 letter, Captain W.H. Smythe wrote about the Aeolian Islands, quote, "Many other vestiges scattered throughout the insular empire of Aeolus tend to show the ancient importance of this assemblage of volcanoes. Greek inscriptions, mutilated sculptures, and empty sepulchres meet the eye in many parts." That the archipelago was deemed to be ancient and old has been shown through not only the archaeology of the islands, but also through the ancient sources. Even the Romans themselves viewed them as ancient, referenced by the great Homer of poet. The islands had abundant usefulness, as we've kind of seen, and they've been very pivotal in the Roman world and in the central Mediterranean in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Valerie. That was so interesting. Hearing about these beautiful islands and the wide range of, the range of time, the timeline from, Mycenaean right through to late Roman. Fascinating. Thank you so much for that. I will stop recording.
Okay.